Decades ago, researchers found a crushed skull in Hubei, central China. This year, it was digitally restored. The new analysis challenges parts of our story about human origins, but only if its model holds up. It's 1 million years old, and researchers say it belongs to an Asian human lineage that us Homo sapiens evolved alongside. If this is right, what does that do to the neat story that humans evolved in Africa? Today, we'll unpack this fossil and explore its implications for our own evolution. Is Asia the new frontier of human evolution? Let's see where the evidence leads. The traditional narrative has always been that the human lineage started in Africa, that this continent shaped Homo sapiens and all our direct ancestors. I recently made a video digging into why most researchers place our origin story here. It quickly became my most watched video, and people seemed to really enjoy it. But more interesting to me were the many debates in the comment section. There were supporters of the African origin story, and those who were skeptical. And right after I published it, this new discovery made international headlines. It poses a serious problem for the narrative I gave in that video. So, to give it the proper context, let's revisit this out of Africa theory, then see how the new fossil fits in. If you want to watch that whole video, I'll leave a link to it in the description and at the end. So the story begins with early primates evolving and spreading around the globe around 50 million years ago. They developed specific traits that set the stage for all future primates. These included things like grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and slightly bigger brains. Over millions of years, various species diversified, and many went extinct. Massive geological shifts opened routes between Asia and Africa. Some primates migrated back and forth, but most of those who stayed in Eurasia died out. Africa became a refuge and a mixing bowl. Drastic climate changes were major drivers for human evolution specifically. The dense African forests and jungles fragmented into more patchy woodlands. Some primates belonging to the ape lineage were then pushed to spend more time on the ground. Walking on just 2 feet became more efficient for traveling long distances and regulating body heat. By around 6 or 7 million years ago, this new form of locomotion began to stick. Fossils from Africa gradually show this, from the earliest hominins to diversified australopiths and early species of Homo. In the world of biology, problems either result in extinction or change. Luckily for us, our ancestors took the second option. Stone tools appear alongside later fossils too. They seem simple to us, but tools like this seriously changed the diets and behaviors of those early humans. They started eating more meat because they were better at hunting and scavenging. Many argue that these extra calories helped us evolve our bigger brains. Among the species whose brains really started to grow, Homo habilis and Homo erectus fossils appear in Africa before similar finds elsewhere. Anatomically modern humans, meaning Homo sapiens, show up in the African fossil record by around 300,000 years ago. However, fossils from other human species have been found around Eurasia around this time and even earlier. This includes Neanderthals and Homo antecessor in Europe. However, successful migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa are typically placed between 50 to 70,000 years ago. Crucially, early Homo sapiens in Africa weren't isolated. The continent hosted a bunch of semi-connected populations. Ideas and genes moved between them, and that network sped innovation. When some groups later spread out of Africa, they mixed with local species like those Neanderthals. But the core biological and cultural package that made us, especially the combination of our big brains, language capacity, social networks, and technology, coalesced in Africa. That is why Africa is the best supported cradle of our species, supposedly. In addition to the fossils and artifacts, genetic evidence also points to an African origin. Modern humans show their greatest genetic diversity here, and diversity builds over time. This means Homo sapiens lived and evolved there longest. It's where they spent enough time to accumulate those mutations and general variation. Populations outside of Africa only carry a portion of that. This is consistent with the idea of small groups leaving around 50,000 years ago. So, all in all, there are two big pillars that have historically supported the traditional out of Africa perspective. First is a rich and continuous African fossil record, where early species and modern traits first appear. Second is how our modern DNA can be traced back to diverse African populations. So, what is this new fossil, and why does it challenge all of that? The specimen in question is called Yunxian 2 and is one of three human skulls found in Hubei, central China. It and Yunxian 1 were unearthed in 1989 and 1990. They were both badly crushed during the fossilization process. The weight of sediment above has seriously distorted them. One was in worse shape than two, but they're nearly complete. Yunxian 3 wasn't found until 2022, and it was in much better condition. However, we still know close to nothing about this last one. Initially, Yunxian 2 was so badly warped that scientists couldn't confidently classify who the fossil belonged to. It also didn't help that before it was discovered, most other human fossils from China were fragmentary. They consisted of isolated teeth and skull caps belonging to Homo erectus, so there wasn't much data to make solid comparisons. Given the limited information they had, researchers suggested Yunxian 2 belonged to Homo erectus, but with some hesitation. They did note how the midface is quote-unquote sapiens-like, and how other Homo erectus fossils from East Asia show some hints of this too. They go on to make a pretty bold claim, saying this: given the common occurrence of a mid-facial anatomy characteristic of Homo sapiens in East Asia, and its less frequent occurrence in Eurafrican hominids, it can be argued that this morphology appears first in Asia and subsequently spread westward. So from the very first investigations into this skull, they knew something fishy was going on. They even suggest that the events leading to the emergence of modern humans were not restricted to one region of the world alone. Adding to this is their age. Yunxian 1 and 2 were clearly old from the jump, but we now have a more accurate estimate. The site they were found consists of terraces along the Kuyuan and Han rivers. Scientists from China and France dated the soil here using electron spin resonance, combining it with U-series dating on their teeth. Electron spin resonance measures trapped electrons in minerals like quartz to estimate how long they've been buried. U-series dating measures the rate of decay of uranium elements in teeth. These methods show that the Yunxian fossils are about 1 million years old. Despite being a professional archaeologist myself and studying this stuff through undergrad and grad school, talking about people who lived 1 million years ago never ceases to blow my mind. But the real kicker is not just their age, it's who these skulls belong to. In September of 2025, researchers published this paper where they reconstructed Yunxian 2. They corrected its distortion using CT scanning and digital retrodeformation, technologies that are new to the field. Based on this reconstruction, the researchers claim that this 1 million year old human was not a member of Homo erectus. Instead, they reclassified it as Homo longi. So, who was Homo longi, and how were they different from Homo erectus? To understand this, we need to know the difference between primitive and derived traits. Primitive traits are those that have been inherited and not new to that species. Just think of how we walk on 2 feet. This isn't new for Homo sapiens. Our ancestors have been doing it for millions of years. Derived traits are new and often separate a species from its ancestors. For us, we can think of the human chin. It's a funny one that most people don't really pay much attention to, but chins are unique to Homo sapiens. No prior human species had this protruding lump of bone on their lower jaw. We still don't really know what its purpose is, if it even has one, but that's a rabbit hole for another video in the future. Homo longi is a proposed clade of Middle Pleistocene humans from East Asia, which puts them between roughly 100,000 and 800,000 years ago. A clade is simply a group of organisms believed to have evolved from a common ancestor, so it can contain multiple different species. As for the Homo longi clade, it retained some primitive traits similar to Homo erectus, but also had some newer derived traits. As a disclaimer, the fossil record from this part of the world is kind of a mess. There are so many different variations and proposed species that we can't explore it all today, so we'll be focusing mostly on the perspective from this paper. Anatomically, the skull shows a mosaic of both primitive and derived traits. Here are some of the primitive traits more typical of Erectus and older species. It had a big, heavy brow ridge with a sloping forehead. The shape of its brain case is elongated, not necessarily rounded. The base of the skull and roof of the mouth are wider than more recent species, and the sides and top of the skull are not strongly domed. On the other hand, its derived traits include the size of its brain case, which is bigger than many Homo erectus specimens, though not fully modern. Its eye sockets sit close together. The area between the brows is more indented, and it has some more modern dental traits, like the shape of its second and third molar. And these are just some of the main traits the researchers analyzed. They then compared the reconstructed skull to other fossils in and around the region. Yunxian shows a close relationship with others that have previously been identified as Homo longi. These include fossils like Jinyushan, Dali, and the Harbin skull. However, it's definitely the oldest out of all of them, and it probably represents one of the earliest members of this clade. So what does Homo longi have to do with the evolution of us Homo sapiens? Doesn't all of this just mean that this particular branch of the human tree evolved in Asia, while we are still predominantly African? Maybe, but putting Yunxian 2 in the same branch as these fossils, like Harbin, complicates things. This is because it adds a special species into the mix, one you've probably heard of. The Harbin cranium is one of the most dramatic human fossils found in East Asia. It was discovered near the city of Harbin in northeast China in the 1930s. The cranium is nearly complete. It is huge, robust, and shares many of those features with Yunxian 2. Researchers coined the name Homo longi to describe this very fossil in 2021. They argued it represents this distinct, deeply branching human lineage in Asia. It's only about 150,000 years old, so it isn't as ancient as Yunxian 2, which has actually proven to be extremely useful. It means it hasn't been as distorted, and much of it is still preserved, including one single tooth. Scientists got the idea to use that tooth to extract DNA. They weren't able to get any from the tooth itself, so they pivoted to the calcified plaque on the tooth. The results were astounding. The DNA aligns with another human species called Denisovans. Protein analysis from this individual came to the same conclusion. In other words, the Harbin cranium, and by extension Yunxian 2, are both Denisovan. So who were these people? It's time to dive into their story. Prior to this discovery, Denisovans were only known from a handful of archaeological sites, only about 4 in total. The groundbreaking excavations were at Denisova Cave in Siberia. It's located in the Altai Mountains, a rugged, glacier-sculpted landscape. It's a remote, dramatic place and full of ancient caves. In 2008, archaeologists started finding the tiny, sparse remains of ancient humans. They included a small juvenile finger bone and several teeth. These remains came from different layers of the cave and spanned many thousands of years. Stratigraphy and dating show that Denisovans lived in the cave from deep in the Middle Pleistocene through the Late Pleistocene. Some of the material could be from around 300,000 years ago at the oldest, and the youngest bones date to roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago. These early insights showed us that these humans were living at the same time as Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. But more on that later when we dive into the fascinating genetics. More extensive than the bones are the artifacts at Denisova Cave. It hosts a rich assemblage of crafted tools and even jewelry. Earlier layers contained stone technologies like lavawa and radial cores, side scrapers, and more conservative flake tools. Later occupations produced more advanced blade industries, bone tools, sewing needles, and an extraordinary set of ornaments. Beads, pendants, mammoth tusk objects, and even ostrich shell rings were found. I've mentioned this bracelet on the channel before, but if this isn't a work of art, I don't know what is. All of these items point to a species capable of symbolic behavior and advanced craftsmanship. In sum, these people had culture. Tibet seems to have been another home for Denisovans. In 2019, scientists reported on a big jawbone excavated from Bashia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau. Protein analysis identified the jaw as Denisovan. U-series dating showed that it's at least 160,000 years old. This was a major find because it expanded their home range. It also shows that they reached and adapted to the high altitude, low oxygen environments of the plateau. The Altai and the Tibetan Plateau are very far and very different from each other. The Altai Mountains sit in southern Siberia, at the crossroads of Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan. This area of the Tibetan Plateau lies far to the south, in western China, and it's a vast plain averaging 4,000 meters above sea level. The two sites are well over 2,000 kilometers apart, but the terrain makes actual travel much longer. That distance and contrast means Denisovans navigated across very different ecosystems. It proves they were traveling long distances across Eurasia, rather than clustering in a tiny localized population. These discoveries are deep in the Eurasian landmass. However, more Denisovan sites have been identified further east, closer to what's been considered Homo longi territory. Human bones in Southeast Asia are exceptionally rare, but now a single molar from Cobra Cave in Laos offers us an exception. This is a limestone cave in the Annamite Mountains, and the dating of its sediments and flowstone puts the molar right around that 150,000-year-old mark. Tooth scans and protein tests show it came from another member of this Homo genus, likely a young female, but they couldn't pinpoint a species with just that, so they took a look at its shape, its form. They found that it conforms nicely to the Tibetan jaw fossil. Based on this comparison, the authors conclude the Laos molar is most likely Denisovan. Lastly, a site that was reported in April 2025. Well, the fossil was discovered about a decade ago, but again, couldn't be classified as anything more specific than an archaic Homo specimen. This time, a jawbone was dredged from the Penghu Channel off Taiwan. A fishing net scooped it up about 25 kilometers off the west coast of the island. It was this 2025 study that found signatures from ancient protein that matched the fossil to Denisovans. If you couldn't tell already, these protein studies are bringing a lot to the table. This is partly because proteins preserve far better than DNA. The circumstances needed to preserve DNA have to be nearly perfect, but we'll return to this in a moment. The bone is robust and heavy like the Tibetan jaw, suggesting this is a widespread trait. It came from a male, but the dating is uncertain. It could be 50,000 years old or much older. Either way, it pushes Denisovans into warmer, coastal East Asia. Overall, fossils tied to Denisovans are few but crucial. They indicate that the species navigated both the cold highlands of Central Asia and the milder lowlands of the southeast. Now, if we consider lumping Denisovans in with Homo longi, this expands their range even further into all the different longi sites. This seems to be the direction we're headed. So now that we have a better understanding of who these people were, how human they were, we can understand how significant the Yunxian cranium is. If it truly represents the skull of a Denisovan, then it pushes the emergence of this amazing species to over 1 million years ago. This would indicate that our species is much older too. Why is that? Because us, Neanderthals, and Denisovans are all related. We share a common ancestor who lived a very long time ago, and the authors of this study have just shaken up who that ancestor was. So in addition to reconstructing the skull, they've also reconstructed the evolutionary timeline. This is where things get interesting. We need to first look at the conventional timeline, and so this is going to require some genetics. Just as a disclaimer, genetics is not my strong suit, but another YouTube channel called Gutsick Gibbon just published a video about this. She is much more well versed in the topic, and her explanation really helped clarify some of these things for me. I highly recommend you check out her video for an even deeper dive into this stuff. I'll leave a link to it below. For years, scientists thought ancient DNA couldn't really survive in fossils, but new technologies have led to new discoveries, and we can now pull DNA from bones that are tens or even hundreds of thousands of years old. It started with Neanderthals. Svante Pabo and his team cracked their genome. It was official. We are genetically related to them. Then, those few strange bones and teeth from Denisova Cave were next on the agenda. Being such a cold place, it was a perfect spot for preserving DNA. So scientists got a sample and found that the DNA didn't match humans or Neanderthals. It was this new Denisovan species. Subsequent DNA studies confirmed they were a distinct branch of humanity, and that they were related to us and Neanderthals, but still unique. And we weren't just long-lost cousins. We appear to have interbred with each other. In fact, we even found the child of a Denisovan and a Neanderthal, a first-generation hybrid. Scientists call her Denny. Her mother was a Neanderthal and father a Denisovan. She was about 13 years old when she died 90,000 years ago, and she represents the much broader blurring of ancient humans that anthropologists struggle with today, which we'll talk about shortly. We've also learned a lot about Denisovans from their DNA trapped in cave sediments. This stems from a new field of research called sedimentary ancient DNA, or cetDNA, where we no longer need bones to find some old genes, just small traces in the soil. This technique was used in Tibet, the results of which supported the idea that Denisovans adapted to life at high altitudes. The researchers followed this up by saying, and they may have contributed such adaptations to modern humans on the Tibetan plateau. So what do they mean by this? Well, it builds upon this idea of interbreeding. We now have a good idea of their genetic profile, and it's taught us some pretty cool things about ourselves. We know that, for example, some populations of modern humans have incorporated Denisovan traits. It's rare in places like Africa and Europe, but becomes more common as you move east into Asia and beyond. Early studies placed Denisovan DNA mostly in island Southeast Asia and Oceania. Newer work says the story is much bigger. Researchers checked over 2,000 people from more than 200 populations around the globe. They scanned genome-wide markers for Denisovan signals. Oceania still had the highest signal. Within Oceania, Denisovan ancestry tracks strongly with populations of New Guinean ancestry, more so than Australian. They also found traces across East Eurasia, but more interestingly, it appeared in Native Americans too. It's small, but widespread. Those signals in East Eurasians and Native Americans correlate with the New Guinean and Australian ancestry, so it points to a shared source. Either they all got their Denisovan DNA from their common ancestor, or there is gene flow between these different ancestral populations. Either way, the Denisovan legacy is broader than we thought. This changes how we see ancient contacts across Asia and Oceania. It suggests multiple pulses of mixing and movement. Building off of this, we can begin to see how Denisovan DNA affects modern people. It's believed that these genes have conferred adaptive benefits to Homo sapiens. For example, a study published in 2024 looked at Denisovan-related adaptations in the genes of two modern human populations from Papua New Guinea. One population lives in the high altitudes of Mount Wilhelm, while the other in the lowlands of Daru Island. They found that the specific frequency of certain Denisovan genes varied depending on the population's environment. Genes linked to early brain development were more frequent in the population living at higher altitudes. They suggest this could have been an adaptation for things like hypoxia or oxygen deprivation, which is more common at these higher elevations. For lowlanders, genes overlapping those associated with the immune system were found at higher frequencies. These could have helped combat pathogens like malaria, which is more prevalent in the lowlands than the highlands. Basically, Denisovan traits persisted in modern humans when they were beneficial. This now extinct species pretty much kept us alive long after they were gone. Needless to say, all of this genetic research has culminated in some conflicting perspectives on how our three species are actually related. Different data tell different family stories. The two primary data sets here are nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Let me explain. Nuclear DNA is the genetic material stored in a cell's nucleus. It's inherited from both parents, and it contains most of an organism's genes. Mitochondrial DNA is a small loop of DNA found in the cell's energy-producing mitochondria. Unlike nuclear DNA, it is only inherited from the mother. So in tracing back nuclear DNA, scientists usually see Neanderthals and Denisovans as the closest cousins. Modern humans branch off from our common ancestor earlier, going their separate way. Mitochondrial DNA sometimes tells a different story. It often groups modern humans with Neanderthals and puts Denisovans as the outsiders. Either way, it's always been believed that our common ancestor originated in Africa. Those who migrated to Europe became Neanderthals, those who migrated into Asia became Denisovans, and those who stayed in Africa became us. This is where Yunxian 2 really starts to complicate things. Instead of using genetics, they compared its morphology to other skulls to see which species matched each other best. Based on their analysis, Yunxian and Denisovans are most closely related to Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals are the outgroup who separated earlier. So their argument is as follows. The new timeline starts with a common ancestor of all three species living about 1.4 million years ago. In this scenario, Neanderthals split off first. Then, Denisovans and Homo sapiens split apart closer to 1.3 million years ago. Yunxian 2 represents an early form of this split. Finally, true Homo sapiens start emerging about 1 million years ago. If true, this is some groundbreaking research. Is it totally rewriting human evolution? No. But is it pushing everything back way further? Yes, by a lot. According to this, our species could be more than twice as old as we thought, considering our current oldest fossil is 300,000 years old. And if we are more closely related to Denisovans than either of us are to Neanderthals, there's the implication that our common ancestor may have come from Asia. A simple model that places all human lineages as derivatives of a single African source has become too simple. If nothing else, Denisovan research has shown that Asia was not merely an empty stage on which African migrants later performed. Instead, it was a theater of early human evolution in and of itself. Evolutionary dynamics across the entire Old World were clearly more complex than we assumed. But it's easy to latch onto these new and exciting ideas. Who wouldn't want to be around to witness a total paradigm shift in how we understand human evolution? As tantalizing as this new fossil is, we shouldn't just shove out of Africa to the wayside. Just like all things in science and history, there are still some caveats. First, the Yunxian study is based entirely on morphology. The genetic research largely conflicts with the older timelines proposed here. Most of our DNA is still traceable to Africa in the late Pleistocene. Genetic admixture with Denisovans and Neanderthals complicates things, yes, but it doesn't overturn the late African origin of our species. So the question is, should we believe the fossil or the genetics? Is one more reliable than the other? A reason why we shouldn't put all of our faith in the fossils is because of what's called convergent evolution. This can trick us when we're just looking at morphology. Robust jaws and big brow ridges can evolve under similar diets or climate, even in unrelated populations. Denisovans and sapiens may have evolved similar traits independent from one another. That's why the fossil story and the genetic story must be woven together, not pitted against each other. This is a major gap in the research that must be filled. We need a better understanding of the tangible relationship between DNA, physical features, and how it relates to human speciation. The second problem is that the longi versus sapien split at around 1.3 million years ago is about the branching off of early Homo lineages, not necessarily about the emergence of fully modern humans. The anatomical signatures of modern Homo sapiens appear much later and are tightly tied to Africa. One explanation could be that after splitting from a common ancestor with Denisovans that lived in Asia, those that became Homo sapiens may have done so after migrating into Africa. And the biggest challenge to all of this, to the study of evolution as a whole, is the very idea of a species in the first place. There have been many proposed definitions of a species. One of the most common is that it's a population of interbreeding organisms that can produce viable offspring. Others exist too, like a phylogenetic species, which are the smallest diagnosable group of a family tree, defined by shared, unique traits that mark a single branch. Ecological species, a group defined by a unique way of life, occupying its own niche in the ecosystem. And evolutionary species, a single lineage through time with its own historical trajectory and evolutionary fate. But many of these start to break down the more we investigate our own evolution. For example, now that we know Homo sapiens, Denisovans, and Neanderthals all interbred to make us, we would all be the same species according to that first definition. In this scenario, we'd be more like different breeds of dogs than totally different species. And maybe that is the right way to approach it, to ditch this human-constructed idea of species. I guess what I'm getting at is, how do you define a human? I want you to really consider this question, and let me know your answer in the comments. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope this video clarified some misconceptions you may have had about this fossil in the headlines. For more, make sure you go back and watch part 1 about human evolution in Africa. I'll see you in the next one.